Bry's Comics.
Welcome to Bry's Comics. This channel is all about comic book investment and speculation with an emphasis on how to have this hobby fund itself. And today's video is a great example of that, chock full of information to take you one step closer to having this hobby fund itself. If that's something that interests you, consider hitting that subscribe button and hit that notification bell. In so doing, it will enter you to win a free slab. We have a brand new giveaway for this month. In next week's video, I will announce the winners of the November prizes. And if you head over to bryscomics.com and sign up for the newsletter, you're also entered to win a free slab each and every month. Use code COLLECT10 for 10% off all in-stock items. That code is always active. You can also find me over on Instagram for fresh content, trades for grails, and live sales. So in this video, we're going to do a general overview of this book right here that was recently released by CGC. It's the official CGC guide to grading comics. It's over 300 pages, about 350 pages, and we're just going to go over exactly what is inside this book, who it's for, who it's not for, and by the end of this video, you will be able to decide for yourself whether this is something that you want to pick up or not. And then in future videos, I'm going to dive a lot deeper into different aspects of this book that I think will be incredibly helpful to new collectors, seasoned collectors alike. So make sure to stay tuned for those videos. Full disclaimer, I am not associated with CGC in any way other than I am a collector and a dealer that submits comics to them all the time. I am not in cahoots with them about this book. I have no interest whatsoever in how this book performs. I'm just a customer and a collector, and this is an honest, organic review of this book. So let me start by giving an example of why this is important, why you should care about this and consider investing time in this. If you clicked on this video, you at least are interested in comic books and collecting comic books, and you probably have an idea that they can be very, very lucrative. I recently saw just the other day a Hulk 181, the first appearance of Wolverine, selling a 9.2 for $15,000, which was $6,000 more than the most recent sale, which was only, shortly before that, a few weeks before that. So why would that book sell for $6,000 more? Today is a down market. There's actually, we're in a down market right now. And if you look at the book, you will see that it was an old label case that had some defects that may be able to be pressed out. It was a good CPR candidate. They could potentially get that 9.2 up to a 9.6, or maybe, fingers crossed, even a 9.8. And if it got that bump, a 9.6 is worth around $30,000 in today's market, and a 9.8 somewhere around $100,000. It's been fluctuating a lot. But as you can see, that $15,000 gamble may pay off for that purchaser. And they're obviously a seasoned, wise collector that saw an opportunity there and were willing to pay more for the chance at having a very good return on investment. It absolutely was a huge risk. They could fall flat on their face with this thing because not all defects are noted in the grader's notes, and so there could be a plethora of other defects holding that book back from ever getting more than a 9.2. So it's definitely a gamble, but I guarantee that they have the intention to crack it out, and they have a lot of knowledge and experience on the matter to be able to make that kind of purchase. And that's what this channel is all about. That's what this video is all about, is getting one step closer to that point where you can make decisions like that and be a wiser collector because of it and enjoy this hobby more because of it. So here we go. The official CGC guide to grading comics, written by Matt Nelson, CGC's president. And I think it's really important when you get this book, if you decide to get this book, to read the foreword, the introduction, the history of the comic book, because it really sets up the framework for the entire thing. And so I promise I'm not going to read every single page in this book, but I do want to read some of the stuff from the disclaimer and the foreword to set the framework for the entire book, because there's some incredibly important information that answers a lot of questions that we've had for many years. So it says here that CGC's grading standards were fine-tuned over the years based on feedback from industry experts and the vast and varied quantity of comic books that pass through the graders' hands. Numerous defects and attributes continue to be identified and quantified, resulting in greater precision and consistency, particularly with regards to the subtle nuances between high grades as well as the diversity of defects present in low grades. So the takeaway from this is that CGC's grading standards have changed over the years. And as we continue, you'll realize why that was necessary and why they will continue to change over time. Evolving enhancement processes, particularly comic book pressing, which became widespread years after CGC opened, also influenced CGC's grading standards. Certain defects removable through expert pressing became far less common, while side effects from improper pressing spawned a new category of defects. The same was true for evolving restoration techniques and the advent of restoration removal. So the takeaway from this is that, in my opinion, grading has gotten stricter over the years, in general terms, because creases and stuff that could have been easily removed by pressing weren't removed by pressing in the initial years. And then after that became a pressable defect, they will grade a pressable defect harsher because it can be easily pressed out. And this just confirms my suspicion is like when you get an old label CGC book and it has a bunch of creases and stuff on it that are non-color breaking that are pressable, if you press them out, it's likely that you'll get the same grade back, because an 8.5 back then when pressing wasn't widespread allowed certain non-color breaking creases, whereas now that pressing is widespread, they don't allow those creases because it's so easy to get them out. So grading standards have changed over time. How they've changed, that's up to you to decide. I'm not here to argue one way or another whether it's looser or harder. That's up to you, but they definitely have changed over time. And although continued refinement of CGC's grading standards has narrowed over the years, occasional modifications are and will continue to be necessary aspect of expert comic book grading. Moreover, even with the most comprehensive and precise standards, grading is ultimately an art, as each comic book presents a unique combination of defects and aesthetics. Opinions of grade can vary even between experts. Now, I am not here to argue that this is not incredibly frustrating. It is incredibly frustrating, but it's important to understand why it is the way it is, right? It might help you to swallow that frustrating pill to know that, as we're going to go on here, all the different types of defects that comic books can have, you can at least understand why there's inconsistencies in grading. Even in-house, and CGC admits that here, that even amongst their own expert graders, there are differences of opinion of grade. And that's why it's so important to understand these different defects, to understand the grading scales, because you could get a book back that's a 6.0 and you could say to yourself, you know what, I think that was a harshly graded 6.0. I want to try again. I want to send it in, and you might get back a 6.5 or a 7.0 if a different grader looks at it. And that could be the difference of thousands of dollars. And that's a great way to have this hobby fund itself. So it goes on to say that the CGC grading standards presented herein represent the most current standards employed by CGC. They may not perfectly align with standards used in the past. In fact, I would argue that they absolutely do not perfectly align with things in the past. They already stated that their standards have changed over time, and this is based on the most current standards. And they may not perfectly align with standards that will be used in the future. See, this is important to understand, is that right now, the comic book market is evolving. Restoration techniques are evolving. Pressing techniques are evolving. Certain things right now that CGC is allowing in a 9.8 may not be allowed in the future. There's a lot of people that are experimenting with restoration techniques right now that CGC is not catching. And I think that that doesn't mean that they're always not going to catch it. It very well could be that they get wise to these certain restoration techniques. So just keep that in mind. CGC grades comic books according to its then current grading standards. Accordingly, this book is for informational use only, is not intended to supersede or otherwise impact any grading determinations on comic books previously graded by CGC. This opens up a lot of questions because they're stating here that their standards have changed over time. So if you have an old label case that was graded according to different standards, it may be like an 8.0, and you may look at that 8.0 and say, there's no way that this book would get an 8.0 in today's standards. This is a 6.0 or 7.0 at best. So what happens if you send that book back into CGC to be reholdered? Well, will they honor the original grade, or are they going to grade it to the more current, more strict standards? My experience has been I have a handful of experiences sending in old label CGC cases that I think were loosely graded, right? I think that if they were graded by the current standards, they would get a lower grade, to have a new case, because the old cases suck, and a lot of times you want to get the case reholdered. And in every instance, the book has come back the same grade as before. So in my experience, they do honor the original grade, even if it's graded according to different standards. The only exception to that is if the book has incurred damage inside the case, and it could incur damage inside the case in many different ways. You could buy it, set it in your windowsill, and have natural light hit it for 10 years, and the colors could completely wash out. Well, guess what? That book is no longer the grade that it received when it was originally graded. Or likewise, there's a little bit of movement inside the case of the book, and if the comic book shifts inside the case, it can damage the book. And if it damages the book inside the case, it's no longer the grade on the label. So it's important to be able to identify when a book has been damaged, because that could impact, the future value of the book. All right, so here for the foreword, I'm just going to read the first sentence and the last sentence because I think it perfectly sums up why all of this stuff matters. Grading is a language. Those who speak this language well are often the best collectors, the most successful dealers, and enjoy comic books for a lifetime. So when you learn to speak this language, it absolutely does make the hobby more enjoyable, because first and foremost, you can fund the hobby so you can buy more comic books. And that is like the most enjoyable thing about collecting comic books, is getting more comic books. And if you can fund the hobby by itself by speaking this language and knowing, the intricacies of grading, it makes it way more enjoyable. For the introduction here, I just want to highlight a couple different parts, because a lot of people have criticized CGC over the years and said, why are they not transparent about their grading standards? And here in the first paragraph, it says, there are indeed more than 100 different defects covered in this book, 109 to be exact. And unlike the small surface area of a coin, a card, or a stamp, those defects can be spread out over 30 square feet of paper, because you have the front cover, the interior pages, and the back cover. And then down here in the bottom, it says, over the years, CGC's grading standards have been dissected in articles, seminars, online discussions. I've done videos on CGC's grading standards, and it was all speculative because none of it was ever presented in one place. And what they're saying here is that the reason for that is that it took a 340-page book to do it. And you can't just simply and easily put up CGC's grading standards. There is so much that goes into it, and now they have actually done it. So this is their presentation to the collecting world, saying this is how we grade comics. It says here, a complete picture of CGC's grading standards has never been presented until now. Given the complexity involved in comic book grading, this is admittedly vast and daunting task, but our growing and evolving market necessitates it. I hope everyone who explores the contents of this book will be richer for it. So Matt Nelson here is recognizing that this is necessary, that they as a company need to have their grading standards presented in an easily digestible way, and they did it with this book. It's not perfect, but this is their answer to that. So it goes on here. This section is the history of the comic book. I highly recommend that you read it. It's incredibly informative, and again, it helps paint the picture of how we got to where we are today. Section 1 talks about the analysis of the comic book. So in this section, you talk about the paper, the gloss, the staples, the ink, the glue, the structure, and the aesthetics, and it goes into photo detail showing everything that a comic book is. And this starts to paint the picture of why grading is so subjective and why it varies so much. The ink, the staples, the glue, the structure changes with the era of comic book. Sometimes even in the same era or just for one specific book, there's a completely different structure and way that that book was put together. And when you understand that, you understand how the grading standards change depending on how these things change. The way that they grade a Golden Age book with a certain paper type is different than the way they grade a modern book with a different paper type. So a spine tick on that book might be allowed, where a spine tick take on this book might not be allowed. Chapter 2 goes into the printing process, which is also important to understand the different eras and how things have changed. Chapter 3 is the 3 sources of defects. This is incredibly important, and it goes into great detail about this, that the defects can come from printing, from interaction with the comic, or from the environment, the way the comic book was stored. And depending on where the defects got onto the book can absolutely affect the grade. A crease that comes from a printing process versus an interaction may be the difference between an 8.0 and a 9.8. Let me explain that. So if you have a silver or golden age book, sometimes there was a printer's crease, which is a crease that goes, a certain length of the book, and it is absolutely allowed in a 9.8. If that crease was a printer's crease, came from the printing process, it's allowed in a 9.8. Whereas if you have a crease, the same length as that printer's crease, and it's from interaction with the book, that book could be an 8.0. And it's very easy to identify the difference between a printer's crease and an interaction crease. So that's why, there's subtleties with this. And it may seem daunting, but the more that you get familiar with it, the more easily you'll recognize these different types of defects. Chapter 4 goes in to talk about the 7 different types of defects. So it breaks it down to creases, tears, missing parts, stains, tanning, substance, distortion, okay? And there are different sources of those defects based on all of the factors involved. Depends on how the book is graded, and this book will explain all of them. Chapter 7 goes into comic book enhancement and talks about restoration and restoration removal and pressing and conservation. Incredibly important to understand how those things affect the grade. Chapter 8 talks about how they affect the comic book. Chapter 9 talks about the grading scale and gives a brief description of grade. And then in the back of the book, it goes into greater detail for each individual grade. Stay tuned for future videos. I'm thinking about doing a video for each one of the grade scales. There's 25 different possible grades that a CGC book can get. Then it talks about page quality and shows examples of the different page qualities, the restoration scale. And then we get into section 3, which is how to grade a comic book. Stay tuned for a future video where I go into the general framework of how CGC grades a comic book. Not the full details. You're going to have to buy the book if you want the full details, but some fantastic information here about how to handle the comic book and how they actually determine the grade. In Chapter 19, it shows how they actually determine a grade for a comic book. Chapter 20 is grading considerations, stuff to take into account. Chapter 21 talks about restoration detection. Chapter 22 talks about formats and editions, very important. You could have a different format or edition of a book that greatly impacts the value of that book. Chapter 23 talks about reprints and variants, also very important. Can really fund the hobby this way if you can figure out how to identify the difference between a rare variant and maybe listed as a regular variant. If you know that difference, you can make some serious money that way. It talks about international editions. Chapter 25 talks about pedigree detection and talks about some of the pedigrees. There's a whole index here for the different pedigrees. This is incredibly important. It talks about restoration, removal, and conservation. This chapter is all about enhancement analysis. And if you can master this, there's some serious money to be made in this hobby. Chapter 28 just talks about how to submit to CGC or CCS, which is CGC's pressing service. I don't recommend you use them at the moment because their turnaround times are way too long. And then section 5, here on page 133, is where we get into an index of defects and enhancements. There's 109 different defects listed here. This is the absolute bulk of this book. It's almost 200 pages of just analyzing every single defect that CGC has in their system. So if you've ever wondered, how does a chew affect the grade? Well, here you can see it can affect the grade from a 0.5 to an 8.5. There's picture examples and a description of how that will affect the grade. Literally every possible defect for a book is listed in here on how it affects the grade. How much does a detached page affect the grade? Well, it depends on the era, and it can affect the grade depending on that era from a 2.5 to an 8.0. But here's all that information. So if you've ever wondered 100, you have a page missing from a giant size X-Men 1, that's going to affect the grade different than a page missing from a Golden Age book or a Modern Age book. And this right here explains all of that. 109 different defects showing how it affects the grade. Absolutely incredible resource right here. Just to have this, you find a book in the wild, you see, oh, I've never seen, that shadow, a dust shadow like that. How much is that going to affect the grade? And it's just an incredibly important and helpful resource right here. The book itself, if for anything else, is worth it just to know how each one of these defects affects the grade of a comic. So here we have the index of grades. There's 25 different possible numerical grades, and this shows the examples and what's allowed in each one from a gem mint to a 0.5, and it shows picture examples for the same book, a Hulk 181, of each grade, a 9.2 versus an 8.5. It literally goes through all 25 of the numerical grades. Incredibly useful. I'm thinking about doing a video for each one. So smash like, subscribe if that is interesting to you. We have some frustrating things in here that I know is going to be very frustrating for people, but also, some really good information to help understand the differences, the subtle differences between these different grades. I've already found one inconsistency in here, and I emailed CGC and actually got a response clarifying it. So lots of good information to come. If that interests you, consider hitting subscribe. And then section 7 talks about the index of pedigrees, which is interesting, but it's not going to, affect that many people. And then, of course, we have a plethora of ads of people that want to buy your comic books, because it's important to remember that CGC is a for-profit company. They sell this book to make a profit. They have these ads in the back to make a profit. And, just consider that when you think about the whole process of comic book grading. So there you have it, guys. My review of the official CGC guide to grading comics. My personal recommendation review of this book is I absolutely love it. I think that this is incredibly detailed. It's way more than I was hoping to get out of this book. It answers a ton of questions that many of us have had and have been moaning about for many, many years. And it finally explains why CGC has been so secretive about their grading standards, is because of how daunting it is to be transparent about it. But they have made a very serious and honest effort in this book, and I think that they did a fantastic job in becoming more transparent. I think it's great that Matt Nelson recognizes the importance of being transparent about their grading standards, and I think that this puts CGC, just one step further ahead of the pack from all the other grading companies because of the detail that is in this book. I'm not a CGC fanboy by any means. I have many gripes with them. I've done a ton of videos, explaining the details of all the problems that I have with them, but I'm an honest person, and I can honestly say that this grading company is head and shoulders above the rest of the pack, and that's just my personal opinion, and this book cements them one step closer in that position. So don't forget to subscribe to the channel, comment on this video, and like this video for your chance to win a free slab. Head over to brycecomics.com and sign up for the newsletter to be entered to win a free slab over there. It's also where you get first access to new inventory. Stay tuned for future videos on this subject that we're going to go a lot deeper. I appreciate you all for sticking with me to the end of the video, and we'll catch you in the next one. Bye.
Bryce Comics.